After escaping from the Bocas del Toro archipelago in early June 2010, Dayton and Laura crossed the border into Costa Rica, intending to lay low. The problem was that their faces were plastered across all newspapers and screens. In mid-July, they attempted to hide in a resort town an hour's drive from San Jose, but the hotel owners recognized them and called the police. With no real choice and the authorities on their tail, involving Interpol and the FBI, they decided to cross the border again. The natural border between Costa Rica and Nicaragua is the meandering San Juan River. On the 26th, Dayton and Laura stole a motorboat, tossing its owner into the water, and headed towards the Nicaraguan side. However, their escape was noticed by a group of soldiers. Confronted by a line of rifles, the fugitives surrendered. They were dressed in t-shirts, shorts, and flip-flops, appearing like clueless, lost tourists. However, their story didn't withstand scrutiny. They were handcuffed on the 2nd and taken to the nearest precinct. Cher Hughes and her husband Keith were enjoying life on a tropical island in Panama. It was a dream that initially seemed unattainable, to leave their mundane jobs, move to an exotic country, and acquire their own tropical island. Cher made it a reality in one of the most improbable places, among the tiny islands of Bocas del Toro, Panama. Cher grew up in St. Louis, where her beauty allowed her to enter the world of modeling at a young age. Later, she moved to Florida, where she started a company for innovative signage. She ran a successful business, was independent, and confidently pursued her dream of saving enough to travel extensively. She had traveled a lot, mainly within the USA, when a friend invited her to visit Bocas del Toro, and Cher couldn't pass up the opportunity. Bocas del Toro is the kind of place people go to escape the ordinary. A group of islands far from the coast of Panama and even farther from the beaten tourist paths. It's a place where life moves much slower and simpler. Cher visited the archipelago with her boyfriend Keith Whirl in 2000 and instantly fell in love with the picturesque land. It took them 7 days to decide where they wanted to spend the rest of their lives. With the money she had saved for traveling the world, she bought herself a piece of paradise. Cher and Keith had met 7 years prior in Florida when the attractive blonde walked into a bar owned by Keith. Seeing her big blue eyes and beautiful smile, Keith knew he was hooked. Keith was a carpenter and had built their dream home himself. He also owned several rental properties, providing them with additional income. Cher cultivated a garden and took in various animals, including a monkey and a Doberman pinscher named Jack, who adored Cher and followed her everywhere. Cher's and Keith's relationship blossomed on the island, and in 2005 they got married, surrounded by friends and loved ones. Cher had a great relationship with her family, and in the following years they often visited her in Bocas del Toro. Particularly in 2010, her sister Judy had planned to visit her. This would have allowed Cher to take her mind off things. The smooth flow of her 5-year marriage with Keith hit some rough patches, and Keith even left the island. Cher was distraught, but they still loved each other, and everyone around them was convinced that they just needed time to reconcile. Against this backdrop, Cher's sister was scheduled to visit, and the girls were excited about the upcoming reunion, constantly discussing joint activities. But suddenly, Cher stopped answering calls and messages. Judy realized something was wrong. She contacted Cher's friends in Panama, who informed her that Cher was not at home, probably having left. When Keith learned that his wife had left the island, he was surprised, but believed he knew where she was. Cher had talked about living in Panama City, a bustling city where she could blend in and contemplate her separation from her husband in a peaceful environment. For people living in Panama, moving back and forth was commonplace. That was part of the charm of the islands, but still, Cher couldn't have just vanished suddenly, leaving her home, belongings, and unanswered calls. Then her friends received a message from her saying she had gone swimming. It inspired them momentarily, but not for long. Several more days passed without a sign of her. Then another message arrived, this time for Keith. It read, "I met someone else. He is better than you," implying that she had left with him. Keith decided to get to the bottom of it. He called Cher's best friend directly and asked if his wife had another man in her life. The friend assured him that there was no such thing, and that Cher genuinely wanted to reconcile with her husband. She couldn't have run away. Keith noticed something else in his wife's messages. They were written in a style that was not typical of her. Even her emails were very well written, with no modern abbreviations, and the capital letter was only at the beginning of the sentence. But this message was written entirely in capital letters with abbreviations. Then the messages simply stopped coming. Cher's Aunt Mary contacted the embassy in Panama and asked for help. They replied that people disappear all the time, and if the niece wanted to be found, she would contact them herself. But when Cher didn't call her father on his birthday, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that she hadn't run away with a guy, wasn't hiding in an apartment in Panama. Something had happened. Her friends tried to figure out what had happened and remembered another American from their company who had also disappeared suddenly. Did anyone know anything about him? What if Cher wasn't the only missing person? On the picturesque islands of Bocas del Toro, a crisis was brewing. It had been 2 months since Cher had stopped communicating. Now her family and friends were questioning whether her disappearance was related to the disappearance of another American, Bo Islar, who had suddenly left the island 4 months before her. Bo was a pleasant but very quiet man. The former antique dealer had moved from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and was considered somewhat of a recluse, to the extent that few noticed when he suddenly vanished. In principle, he could have left without telling anyone, as it is easy to disappear from Panama. His action became even clearer when it was revealed that he had sold his house to William Adolfo Cortez, also an American living in Panama. Bo had mentioned to friends that he wanted to sell the house and move to a new place. Apparently, that's exactly what he did. But the memory of Bo's house continued to bother Keith, Cher's husband, after the man left. The house looked as if its owner had just stepped out for a minute to the store. Towels hung on the back of a chair, dirty dishes were piled in the sink. His shoes and cane were by the entrance. It was strange, so rumors began. 2 Americans had disappeared. Could their disappearances be related? When it was discovered that Bo had stopped paying his bills, which was entirely unlike him, mutual acquaintances of Bo and Cher became concerned and contacted the police. But they had no grounds to begin an investigation because 2 adults who had previously expressed their desire to leave had disappeared. Then, Bo and Cher's friends turned to someone who could help them. Another foreigner, Don Winner, the owner of a news site for expatriates living in Panama. Long ago, Don arrived in Panama with the American military intelligence and stayed there. The case of the 2 missing Americans caught his attention, so from Panama City he traveled to Bocas del Toro and simply started talking to the locals, trying to find out what they knew about the situation. Indeed, everyone confirmed that Bo and Cher couldn't have just disappeared and left everything behind. He checked and found out that Cher and Bo's passports hadn't left Panama. That meant they were still here. But where? There was another piece of the puzzle that pointed directly to a man living among them. Bo Islar was someone who had left last autumn. At the time, no one found it unusual, especially considering that he had sold his house to another foreigner, William Adolfo Cortez, known to everyone as Wild Bill. It should be noted that everyone on the island was simply called by their names or nicknames. For example, Keith and Cher were nicknamed Ken and Barbie. The owner of the local farm and bar was known as Wild Bill. Bill and his wife Jane had opened a bar in a remote area, accessible only by boat, where foreigners sometimes gathered for a drink or two. Usually, the flamboyant and charismatic Wild Bill stood out even among the fairly colorful personalities in Panama. He had established a local pirate club and was known for his lively parties. Don Winner delved deeper and found out that Bill had not only acquired Bo's house. Shortly after Bo disappeared, Bill and his wife became the president and secretary of a company they had created. Bill quickly renovated the house and advertised it for sale. It seemed like he was involved in buying and selling real estate. He had acquired a house in 2007 from the Brown family, who lived nearby Cher's house, the father, mother, and teenage son. Then he got Bo's house. However, it was only his next purchase that drew universal attention to him. Wild Bill unexpectedly announced that he had acquired all of Cher's property, including the island itself and the guest cottages built by Keith. Moreover, the island still had Keith's tools, Cher's belongings, and even her pets. Bill claimed that Keith would handle the matter with his wife when she returned. Keith requested at least the dogs and the tools back. Bill then returned 1 dog and several tools. Keith didn't intend to confront Bill, especially since everything was under Cher's name, and she did have the right to sell the property without informing her husband. But Keith couldn't believe it. They never fought over money. The island had become their home, and Cher simply wasn't the kind of person to act in this manner. Her relatives didn't believe it either. So Cher's Aunt Mary simply picked up the phone and called Wild Bill. She asked to see the property sale document. The man replied that he had signed a non-disclosure agreement. Mary asked to see the agreement and inquired if Scher had mentioned to Bill what she intended to do next. Bill stated that she had moved into an apartment in the capital. What about her belongings? Bill assured her that at Scher's request, he had sent her belongings, valuables, and money by air courier. Mary demanded to see the receipts for sending these things. She was convinced that Scher would never allow a barely acquainted man to rummage through her belongings in search of jewelry. There was more to it. No one could understand why Scher's entrusted dog, Jack, constantly jumped into the water and swam 2 kilometers to Bill's house again and again. However, Bill had many other concerns to think about besides the dog. Formerly cheerful and gregarious, he now tried to keep to himself, evading conversations. He was clearly nervous, and there was a reason for it. The more Don investigated the rumors, the more he became convinced that Bill was the key to finding Beau and Scher. It was a common denominator between the two of them. He had acquired their property, and both of them had disappeared. Don Winner decided to approach the official authorities and urged Kit to do the same. Kit went to the capital and informed the DIJ, the equivalent of the FBI in Panama, about everything. They did not brush him off and got to work. However, despite all the suspicions, there were no signs of criminal activity. There was essentially nothing to investigate. Then Don had an idea. He had heard a lot about how Wild Bill had an AK-47 and how he would sometimes shoot it to impress his friends. But in Panama, it is illegal for a civilian to possess such a weapon. Therefore, Don suggested that the police conduct a search, arrest him for possessing the weapon, and investigate what role he might play in the disappearance of the 2 people. And that's what they did. In July, officials flooded Wild Bill's house in uniform. The owners were nowhere to be found. The police began to search. They were looking for weapons when they saw Jack, Scher's dog. He had once again swum to Bill's house. The dog was behaving very nervously, circling around, barking at the policemen, and constantly running up the slope as if asking them to follow him into the jungle. The police officers, to their credit, followed Jack and found the spot where a pit had recently been dug. Kit was waiting at the foot of the hill at the time. He saw the officers climb up with shovels. They descended 2 hours later and asked him to look at something. In a shallow grave under a heap of garbage, the police found Scher Hughes's body. She had been shot once in the back of the head. It was only now that Kit began to understand why Jack kept returning to Bill's house. He would swim 2 kilometers and just stand there by his late owner's grave, but the horror did not end there. As the police continued to search Bill's property, they found another mound of land. Under it lay Beau's body. He had also been shot in the back of the head. Furthermore, in Wild Bill's house, the police found a mass of other evidence, documents belonging to Scher and Beau, as well as Scher's phone from which messages had been sent. The police issued an all-points bulletin for Wild Bill and his wife, Jane, whom they also considered involved in the crimes. But they were too late. The 2 had disappeared. Bill and Jane were on vacation when, on June 11, 2010, a friend informed them that the police were at their house. That same night, they left for Costa Rica, where they moved from hotel to hotel, but they were recognized there, and they made a desperate attempt to get to Nicaragua by boat, where soldiers intercepted them at a checkpoint. It was only then that it was revealed that the man's real name was William Dathan Holbert. 30-year-old Dathan had been evading the American police since 2006. He had an impressive criminal history that stretched from the white sandy beaches of Bocas del Toro to the mountains of North Carolina. It was there that he was born, played football on the school team, got married, became the father of 3 children, and worked as a landscape designer. He was well liked by his employer at the sports center until he embezzled $25,000. And that was just the beginning. Dathan quit his job and his wife and fled with Laura Michelle Reece, who later transformed into Jane Cortez. In 2005, he began to commit real estate fraud. He sold someone else's house for $200,000. By the time the house's owner found out what had happened, Dathan had vanished. Meanwhile, he sold a stolen car, and when he was pulled over for speeding in Wyoming, he simply fled. However, after the man moved to Panama, his crimes became more sinister. The people of Panama were horrified, but they did not know that Dathan had much more heinous crime under his belt. Now, behind bars, Wild Bill was ready to reveal all his secrets, to which the people of Panama were not prepared. 27-year-old Laura Michelle Reece gave absolutely no comments and refused to speak to the police. She claimed to know nothing about the family that sold them the house in Panama, how much her husband paid for the property, or who the decorations, chains and bracelets of Cher Hughes, which were on Laura at the time of the arrest, belonged to. On the contrary, Dayton turned out to be surprisingly friendly and talkative. He was happy to return to Panama, happily conversing with journalists in Spanish. Dayton admitted that he invited Beau under the guise of a meeting with his lawyer regarding the sale of the house. He shot the man in the back of the head when he was driving him on his boat. As for Cher, it all started with friendly gatherings and dinners at his house. After that, he led her to see some animals behind the house, and when she turned to look at them, he killed her. The motive was obvious: money. He wanted to take possession of their property. But even the most experienced police officers were shocked when they heard what else Dayton had done. He drew a plan of his house, marking crosses where the bodies were buried. On his map, they counted not 2 crosses, but 5. Not only Cher and Beau died at the hands of Wild Bill, but also the father, mother, and their teenage son. The Brown family, one owners of Bill's house, Cher's neighbors. Dayton saw Michael Brown's advertisement for the sale of the house and called him. The men agreed to meet. Initially, Dayton planned to rob Michael, but when he saw his house in a remote, picturesque place, he changed his mind and decided to kill him and his family. Michael confided in Dayton and told him about his business. He explained that he managed capital through a shell company. Similar companies dealt with bearer shares. In essence, whoever owned the shares was the owner of the corporation. Michael's property in Panama also belonged to the company. If I kill him, Dayton pondered, the shares will be mine, and along with them, the real estate. So, being a guest in Michael's house, Dayton somehow asked the owner to show him the well he had dug on his property. He agreed and led him to the well. There, Dayton shot him in the back of the head. He returned to the house and told Michael's teenage son, Watson, that his father asked him to take a shovel and help him. He killed the son in the same way and in the same place as the father. Then he returned to the house and found Michael's wife, Manchitha Nankratok, in the garden. She was bent over, tending to the flowers. Dayton shot her too. To make sure that all 3 were dead, he fired an extra bullet into each. In the owner's cabin, he found documents and passwords from bank accounts. So he claims, although after the fate of the Brown family became known, there were rumors that Dayton tried to force Michael before killing him. Michael kept money in Hong Kong and transferred small sums to Panama. Dayton requested a new card with a new PIN because he didn't know the old one. He sent the request to Hong Kong because in Panama, they would have asked for identity confirmation. After some time, Dayton received the card in an envelope at the post office. All he had to do was say that he was picking it up for Michael Brown. In Bocas del Toro, such things are easier to do than said, boasted the man. In addition, Dayton confessed to killing another American, Jeffrey Klein. Dayton claimed that he died when they fought on a boat and that to avoid punishment, he devised his way of getting rid of the body. He buried him and then, after a few days, set up a picnic area near the burial site. After the truth came to light, people perceived him as a serial killer who kept victims' belongings in his house as souvenirs. But he himself claims not to be a serial killer. He does not deny the crimes and immediately confess to them, but they never gave him any pleasure. He did not wake up one morning with the decision to kill his neighbors. Dayton knows that he got what he deserved, but he cries and repents only for his wife, who now has to go through all of this. It will take 7 years to achieve justice. During this time, his wife divorced Dayton while the two were in prison. In August 2017, he was found guilty and sentenced to 47 years in prison, while his wife was sentenced to 26 years. If he has other victims, it will be practically impossible to find out. After all, Dayton mainly hunted loners before he met Cher. Choosing a sociable girl with a lot of friends and relatives who would not stop looking for her was his main mistake. It's no wonder they say that some people never disappear. Even while in prison before the trial, Dayton used his phone, computer, and internet access. He continued to log into his Facebook page and even became a sponsor of the prisoners' football team, buying them sports uniforms. Today, he serves as the chairman of the Christian Organization for Inmates, leads an international human rights organization for prisoners, was appointed a chaplain and later a pastor of the Catholic Church in prison. Finally, he acts as a mediator and negotiator between various aggressive prison gangs. On January 7, 2019, he married a local girl, Elizabeth Nunes, and confesses that he enjoys conjugal visits very much. At the end of the year, Dathan published his prison memoirs, in which he described his escape from the authorities, arrest on the Nicaragua-Costa Rica border, extradition to Panama, and the first years in confinement.
Before you is one of the most chilling scenes ever captured on camera. Real footage of a serial killer on the hunt. The murder kit awaited its moment to claim yet another life, but fate intervened as its owner was already under police surveillance. A bloody trail followed him from a sunny resort in the UK to a picturesque town in southern Italy. The criminal genius left clear clues near his victims, mocking the detectives and leading them astray. A strange fetish drove the man to commit unimaginably cruel acts, but ultimately, it led to his devastating downfall. On September 12, 1993, the Claps family was preparing for a pleasant Sunday getaway at a small cottage in Tito, far from their bustling hometown of Potenza, Italy. Alongside their parents, Antonio and Filomena, was their 20-year-old son, Luciano. All three were awaiting the arrival of their eldest son, 24-year-old Gildo Claps, and their younger daughter, 16-year-old Elisa Claps. They were supposed to arrive afternoon with Elisa's friend, Eliana de Silis. Elisa and Eliana had agreed to attend a service at the church in the town center. Afterward, the girls planned to return home to Elisa's and then join the rest of the family for lunch at the cottage. When an hour passed and the girls didn't return, Gildo began to worry. His sister was always punctual and would call home if she was running late. Someone rang the doorbell. It was Eliana. She and Elisa had separated at the church, and Eliana assumed her friend had already returned home. Eliana was surprised that Elisa was still missing. Concerned, Gildo walked through the town center, searching for his sister. There were many people near the church, but Elisa was nowhere among them. When Gildo and Elisa didn't arrive by 2 p.m., the rest of the family returned to Potenza to find out what was happening, and were shocked to hear that the girl had gone missing. Gildo asked Eliana to recount his sister's exact movements that morning. That's when Eliana confessed that she hadn't been completely honest. They didn't attend the service. It was a pretext for Elisa to meet with her acquaintance, 21-year-old dental technician student Danilo Restivo. Although he came from a respected family, with his father being the director of the local branch of the National Library, the young man was not popular and often became the target of ridicule, especially from girls. Elisa, being a kind and compassionate person, felt sorry for him. However, she made it clear to him that there could be nothing between them. But on that day, she agreed to meet him because he insisted on giving her a gift to congratulate her on passing her exams. Elisa and Danilo arranged to meet at the church at 11:30 a.m., when the service was ending. Eliana was waiting outside, where she accidentally ran into another friend, Angelica. The girls didn't see Elisa leave the church but assumed they might have missed her in the crowd. As Danilo was the last person to see his sister, Gildo called his home, demanding an explanation. Danilo explained that their meeting lasted 15 minutes, during which they sat at the altar and chatted. After that, Elisa left the church, while Restivo stayed behind to pray, and that was the last time he saw her. When Elisa didn't return home after several hours, her brother Luciano went to see Restivo personally. Danilo was visibly nervous and evasive in his answers. Luciano noticed a large bandage on his left hand and asked what happened. Restivo explained that he tripped at a construction site and cut his hand. He reiterated that he didn't know where the girl was. Elisa's family reported her disappearance to the police and requested that Restivo be questioned, but their plea was dismissed, and they were advised to go home and wait for the girl to reappear on her own. Not knowing what else to do, Gildo returned to the church but found the door locked. He arranged to be let inside and searched the premises once again. Behind the altar, he noticed another locked door that led to the top floor of the church. Gildo asked for that door to be opened as well, but he was informed that the only person with a key was the priest, Father Domenico Sabbia, who had left for a few days at a spa resort. 2 days later, when there was still no news from the girl, the police finally spoke to Danilo, who claimed that Elisa was unhappy at home and wanted to run away to Naples, but he tried to dissuade her from this idea. He stuck to his version that she left the church after their brief conversation, while he stayed behind. He didn't mention the gift for Elisa but said he asked her advice regarding another girl, Paola, whom he wanted to date. After the conversation, he went home through a construction site where he had been with Paola a few days ago, fell from an unfinished escalator, and cut his hand. Detectives doubted the truthfulness of Danilo's words. Firstly, he was surprisingly precise in his statements. Secondly, there was no evidence that Elisa wanted to run away from her loving family. Finally, it was unclear how he only cut his hand and didn't break his glasses after falling headfirst from the under-construction escalator. The police visited the Restivo family's home, requesting to see the clothes their son wore on that day. However, Danilo's father refused to cooperate without a warrant. The police left empty-handed, convinced that Restivo was hiding something, and checked his name in the database. It turned out that he had already had troubles with the law at the age of 14 when he attacked other boys he was playing with. And that wasn't all. Several months ago, 3 female students living near his house accused him of stalking. He clearly enjoyed instilling fear in girls by calling them at home and describing what they were wearing or playing them terrifying music from the horror movie Profondo Rosso. Investigators were also informed that Danilo had an extremely strange habit. He liked to cut strands of hair from strangers in public transport. The police had heard about these incidents but unfortunately couldn't prove that Restivo was behind them. Meanwhile, news of Elisa Clapp's disappearance quickly spread throughout the country, and the family received constant calls from pranksters claiming that they had the girl and she was fine. The police dismissed most of these calls, although a few messages claiming to have seen the girl in a white Fiat Uno caught their attention. The thing is, one of Elisa's friends, Angelica, revealed that another admirer of hers, a 20-year-old named Reece, was walking around the city center on that day. Reece had recently arrived from Albania with his family. When Reece was invited for questioning, he denied being at the church and provided the police with the names of friends who could confirm his alibi. However, not only did his friends fail to corroborate his story, but they also stated that he was indeed in the city center on the day of the girl's disappearance. Moreover, he drove a white Fiat Uno, the same type of car that several witnesses claimed to have seen Elisa in on the day of her disappearance, and one witness identified Reece as the driver of that car. Suspicions of Reece's involvement grew when the police found Elisa's diary, which was missing several pages. Forensic experts were able to reconstruct fragments of those pages and discovered that some words were written in the Albanian language. Reece was questioned several more times, and each time his story changed. At one point, he claimed that Danilo Restivo instructed him to deny knowing each other. Eventually, Reece was charged with giving false testimony. In December, an anonymous call was made to the police. The female caller claimed to have seen Elisa in Rome. She said that Elisa had been beaten and forced into a white Fiat Uno. Towards the end of the call, the voice said,
"Please, help her. And help me."
The recorded call was analyzed, and the results were astonishing. The caller turned out to be Eliana. Her words had long raised suspicions among investigators because she frequently changed her version of events. Like Reece, she was charged with giving false testimony. While the police could not completely rule out the possibility that Elisa had run away from home, detectives gradually came to the conclusion that the girl was no longer alive, and Danilo was responsible for her disappearance. He may have coerced other acquaintances of hers to lie to the police, but without a body, They had nothing to charge him or any other suspect with, except for the false testimony charges. On the other hand, the Claps family was convinced that influential people, including friends of Danilo's father and the priest of the church where she went missing, were protecting the reputation of their daughter's killer. Father Domenico Seppia, in particular, did not allow anyone to enter the church's attic and refused to allow a box to be placed in the building where anyone could anonymously leave a note with information about Elisa, even though all other churches readily agreed to it. He even attempted to deny knowing Danilo at all, but this was quickly disproven when a photograph surfaced showing them together on Danilo's 18th birthday. Based on all the gathered facts, Danilo Restivo was ultimately arrested for giving false testimony. He was found guilty and sentenced to 20 months in prison. After the trial, Gildo was amazed by the judicial system, wondering how someone could be found guilty of giving false testimony, and yet not be compelled to tell the whole truth. Nevertheless, Danilo served half of his sentence, and was released. The police had nothing more to charge him with. Eliana and Eris were not found guilty of perjury by the judge because they supposedly provided false testimony not to confuse the investigation but out of fear for their own lives. On the second anniversary of Elisa's disappearance in Potenza, all kinds of rumors circulated, such as her being in the hands of the Sicilian mafia, having a secret relationship with a priest, or being sold by human traffickers. The family was constantly harassed by people demanding money for information about the girl. Despite the difficulties, Elisa's relatives actively encouraged public interest in the case. When the internet began to gain popularity, they created a website to provide updates on the investigation. On April 23, 1999, an email allegedly written by Elisa arrived on the website. She claimed to have left Potenza, and was living in Brazil. The girl asked for forgiveness for causing pain to her family but explained that she was unhappy and had to leave forever. She added that this would be her first and last letter to the family. Filomena desperately wanted to believe that her daughter was alive and happy. However, her sons were not convinced, knowing that their sister had left home without money or a passport. They hired a private detective to trace the IP address of the email, only to discover that it was sent not from Brazil but from an internet cafe in Potenza. The cafe staff provided a list of all visitors on that day, and it turned out that Danilo Restivo was in the cafe at the time the email was sent. Elisa's family immediately informed the police and demanded that Danilo be questioned, believing that he had devised this plan to convince them to give up the search for the girl. However, they were told that the active phase of the investigation had been concluded, and there was nothing more they could do. Bournemouth, a resort town located on the southern coast of Britain, is 2,000 kilometers north of Potenza. Tuesday morning, November 12, 2002, started like any other for the Barnett family in Bournemouth. 48-year-old Heather Barnett dropped off her children, 11-year-old Caitlin and 14-year-old Terry, at school and returned home after 8:30 a.m. Heather, as usual, wanted to have her morning cup of tea and get to work. She worked from home, making custom curtains, pillowcases, and similar items. She always had many orders, and that day was no exception. A few hours later, Terry and Caitlin returned home from school. The unlocked front door made the kids slightly uneasy. For their mom, who was definitely at home because her car was parked in the driveway, and the radio was playing. Their mom didn't respond. After searching all the rooms except the bathroom, Caitlin called for her brother. For some reason, she didn't want to go in there. After knocking and receiving no response, the children pushed the door, and it slowly swung open, revealing a horrific scene. Their mother was lying on the floor, clearly a victim of a very brutal crime. Terry called emergency services and led his screaming sister outside to wait for the ambulance and police to arrive. The neighbor across the street happened to be parking their car when they noticed the two hysterical children. They brought the children into their home, reassuring them that they would be safe there. The arriving police discovered that nothing was stolen, and there were no signs of forced entry. The crime itself occurred shortly after the woman dropped off her children at school. Luminal testing revealed shoe prints, size 9, leading from the bathroom to the woman's workshop, and then abruptly disappearing in the middle of the room. It became clear that the killer had changed from dirty footwear to clean ones, which they had brought with them, before leaving the house. Fibers on the woman's body indicated that the perpetrator was wearing gloves. All the evidence pointed to a carefully planned crime. The killer came prepared with a change of footwear and clothing, a hammer, a knife, and gloves. However, they left behind one piece of evidence. There was a green hand towel with Heather's blood on it lying on the workshop chair. The towel did not belong to the family, and considering where it was found, only the killer could have placed it there. They used it to wipe the blood from their face and hands before changing clothes. But the most intriguing evidence was the locks of hair found in the woman's hands. Initially, the police assumed that she had managed to pull out a strand of the perpetrator's hair, but forensic analysis revealed something unexpected. The hair had been neatly cut with a sharp instrument, and while the hair in one hand belonged to Heather, the hair in the other hand belonged to another woman. The detective spoke with Caitlin Berry and learned that a week before the murder, their spare house keys had gone missing. Heather had changed the locks but suspected their neighbor, who had recently visited to order curtains for his girlfriend. It was the same neighbor who comforted the children, an Italian man they knew as Danny. Danilo Restivo, known as Danny to the neighbors, moved to Britain in May 2002 and settled with an Italian woman named Fiona Mozengo, whom he met online. Their house was directly opposite Heather Barnett's house. The police spoke with Danilo immediately upon arriving at the crime scene, and he promptly informed them that he had an alibi for the entire morning. He claimed to have taken a bus to a computer center, where he attended classes. The police checked his bus ticket and the registration log at the center, and his statements were fully corroborated. However, when an officer visited Danilo's house 5 days later to collect DNA samples and asked to see the footwear he wore on the day of the crime, he reluctantly led the detective to the bathroom, where his sneakers were soaking in a bucket of bleach. He explained that he was cleaning them. This raised suspicion for the detective, who confiscated the shoes. However, the sneakers did not match the footprints found in Heather's house. Despite the lack of direct evidence, the police had a reason to be suspicious of Danilo Restivo due to his suspicious behavior regarding cleaning his sneakers. They decided to run his name through a database and made a shocking discovery. This was not the first time that Restivo's name had been linked to a criminal investigation. Over 10 years ago, he may have been involved in the disappearance of a young Italian girl named Elisa Claps. Investigators re-examined his alibi for that case as well and found it to be less reliable than it initially seemed. The time of his registration in the computer center's logbook had been altered from 10:28 to 9:28, and it was done rather clumsily. Although he had a bus ticket with the specified travel time, nothing would have prevented him from getting off at the next stop and returning to Heather's house. Moreover, surveillance cameras captured a man resembling him crossing the road near Heather's house at 9:24. Unfortunately, the video quality was poor and did not allow for a precise identification of the man. Nevertheless, for the second time in his life, Danilo became the prime suspect in a case, but once again, all the evidence against him was circumstantial. The detectives contacted the police in Potenza, where they were informed about Danilo's rare fetish of cutting locks of hair from unknown girls. This information only strengthened the investigators' belief in his involvement in the crime. In April 2004, the police began surveillance on Danilo Restivo, and quickly learned about another suspicious habit of the suspect. Restivo liked to visit a remote park in Throop near Bournemouth, where he would hide behind bushes and observe girls who were jogging or walking their dogs. On May 12, despite the almost summery weather, he was in the park wearing 2 sets of clothing, including waterproof pants, gloves, sunglasses, and a hooded sweatshirt that covered his face. His behavior was so suspicious that the police were afraid they wouldn't be able to prevent another murder. To avoid revealing the surveillance, several officers in uniform approached the suspect, pretending to investigate car thefts in the park, and asked to inspect his belongings. The police found what they called Restivo's murder kit, including a ski mask, scissors, gloves, wet wipes, garbage bags, and a large knife. Restivo remained calm and claimed he had found the knife in the grass and took it to prevent children from getting hurt. When asked what he was doing in the park, he said he was collecting insects for his pet lizard. Even the police had to admit that it was a plausible explanation for why he was hiding in the park bushes, and once again, the detectives had nothing concrete to confront Danilo with. It was decided to change tactics and seek assistance from the public. The investigators wanted to find the owner of the hair strands found in Heather's hand. They reached out to the media in both Britain and Italy and received numerous calls from girls who reported having their hair cut in public transportation incidents, particularly in Britain since 2002 when Restivo moved to Bournemouth. All the girls provided DNA samples, but none matched the strand of hair found at the crime scene. For some time, the investigation reached a dead end until 2007 when the strand of hair was reanalyzed using a new technology that could determine where the owner of the hair had lived. It was revealed that the hair belonged to a girl who lived in the UK, but she had visited Valencia, Spain, 2 months before her hair was forcibly cut, and a few weeks later, she had been to Tampa, Florida. The police, inspired by such detailed information, reached out to the public again, but without success. It's possible that the girl simply wasn't following the news, but the police fear that she may have become a victim of the killer's previous crime. Despite this initial setback, science eventually played a role in the case. In 2009, forensic experts re-examined the green towel from Heather's house as technology had significantly advanced, and they hoped to uncover something new. This time, the experts were able to separate Heather's blood from the sweat and skin particles of another person. Although it couldn't be claimed with 100% certainty that it was Danilo Restivo's DNA, an expert stated that there was only a 1 in 57,000 chance that it belonged to someone else. In the same year, Restivo's sneakers were examined using more modern techniques, and traces of blood were found on the insoles. This indicated that there was blood on Restivo's socks when he put on the shoes. It corroborated the detective's theory that the perpetrator had brought a change of shoes. Unfortunately, the bleach used made DNA analysis entirely impossible, once again preventing a direct link between Danilo and Heather's death. Restivo knew what evidence he could potentially leave behind, so he took precautions by changing his clothes, wearing gloves, and using bleach to remove blood stains. He was aware of the things that could connect him to the crime scene and did everything to hinder that. He was prepared, had a plan, and acted accordingly. Fortunately, the police will be able to accuse Restivo of Heather's murder, but not before a horrifying discovery is made in Italy. On March 17, 2010, something unexpected happened. In Potenza, workers were repairing the local church where Elisa had disappeared years ago. The priest had passed away 2 years prior, and the attic door was no longer secured. 2 workers went upstairs, with one of them searching for roof damage, illuminating his way with a flashlight. It was then that he noticed something lying in the corner of the room, hidden behind construction debris. To his horror, he realized he was looking at a mummified body. The girl was identified by her shoes, glasses, and watch, which were found on her body. Elisa Claps was discovered in the very same church where she had disappeared 17 years ago. As later determined by the forensic examiner, she had died on the day of her disappearance, and her body had been dragged away and hidden. Signs of violence were found on her body. However, the most incriminating pieces of evidence were different strands of hair found in her hands and several more near the body. A sample of foreign DNA found on the girl's body was sent for analysis to Professor Vincenzo Pascali in Rome. However, he had a connection to the church where the crime took place and conducted the investigation rather carelessly, to say the least. He stated that the DNA did not match Danilo Restivo. But when the investigator decided to double-check this conclusion and sent the DNA sample to another laboratory, it matched with Restivo's DNA. The professor was suspended from work for 18 months, and Restivo was finally arrested on May 19, 2010. On June 30, 2011, after 5 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict, finding Danilo guilty of Heather's murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, on November 21, 2012, he won an appeal, and the court changed the punishment for Heather's murder, sentencing him to a minimum of 40 years in prison. On November 11, 2011, in absentia, Restivo was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murder of Elisa Claps. Given Danilo Restivo's evident inclination towards murder, investigators consider it important to explore his connection to other unsolved crimes in both Britain and Italy. His potential involvement in the death of a 27-year-old student from North Korea, who was studying English in Bournemouth, is considered the most likely. On July 12, 2002, 2 months before Heather's murder, the girl known as Jong-ok Shin or Oki was walking home after an evening spent with friends. She was literally 3 blocks away from Restivo's house when an unknown assailant inflicted a fatal injury on her. Oki managed to fend him off by screaming and even informed medical personnel that the attacker was wearing a ski mask. Another man was convicted for this crime after 3 attempts, but his conviction was based solely on the testimony of a female informant who had previously given false statements and often found herself in a state of intoxication. Her account was full of contradictions, and she didn't even mention the ski mask on the killer. Supporting the theory of Restivo's involvement is the physical resemblance between the 2 girls. Additionally, the fact that the crime occurred on the 12th of the month, just like the murders of Elisa and Heather, and even Restivo's visit to the park where his murder kit was found, suggests the significance of this date to him. The wound on Oki's body matches the length of the knife discovered with Danilo in the park. Moreover, various strands of hair were found on the sidewalk near Oki, although there was a hair salon nearby, making it difficult to determine their origin definitively. Legally speaking, Oki's case is considered closed, and Danilo Restivo has officially been charged with 2 murders. However, investigators are confident that there may be more victims. While Elise's body was carefully hidden, Heather was heartlessly put on display for her own children to find. According to experts, this indicates an evolution in the criminal, demonstrating that he was unable to stop on his own.
Unlike other serial killers, he was considered an anomaly, a maniac who didn't fit the typical profile of a bloodthirsty, evil, uncontrollable murderer. Instead, he was someone who sincerely felt remorse and wished to remain locked away for life, wanting to prevent harm to anyone else. He cried out for help, yet no one came to his aid. What in his life made him the way he became? Let's delve into the story of a man let down by estranged parents, a troubled upbringing, and a flawed law enforcement system. This is the tale of a serial killer known as the Deranged Dave. David Edward Maust was born on April 5, 1954, in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, to George and Ava Maust. Apart from David, the family had 3 other children. The family's life was challenging. Both George and Ava had difficult childhoods themselves. His father was put up for adoption at the age of 12, and thus the parents didn't know how to create a loving home for their own children. George was often absent from home, trying to stay away from his wife, who required constant attention, was emotionally unstable, and self-centered. Right after the birth of David's younger brother Jeffrey, their mother was hospitalized for a month due to a nervous breakdown. It's possible she suffered from postpartum depression, but at that time, medicine didn't have much understanding or help for women in such conditions. In 1963, when David was only 7 years old, his parents divorced. Evidently, the divorce was initiated by David's father, as he had stopped supporting his ex-wife and the 4 children for a year, leaving the woman to take care of the family on her own. David's sister later recalled that life at their parents' home was difficult for all the children, but David had it the hardest. Perhaps because he bore a strong physical resemblance to his father, and since their mother despised her ex-husband, her hatred transferred onto her son. Eva claimed she couldn't control the boy. Allegedly, by the age of 8, David had tried twice to kill his brother Jeffrey. Once by pushing him into the water in a lagoon and stepping on his fingers so he couldn't climb out, and another time by attempting to set Jeffrey's bed on fire. His mother also claimed she often checked her son's pockets because he might have stolen things from other people. According to her, he would steal her valuables and sell them, all of which supposedly occurred before he turned 9. Because when he turned 9, Eva declared that she no longer wanted to deal with a difficult, problematic child. She approached the court, stating that she needed help because he was mentally ill, and the 9-year-old child was admitted to an institution for the mentally ill. However, the staff and doctors noticed no signs of behavior as described by Eva. Rather, they concluded that the mother had simply abandoned her son. If life at home was already difficult for the boy, it became even worse. He had to share common spaces with dozens of other people, patients with schizophrenia, developmental disorders, and aggressive criminals. David felt anger and incomprehension. He felt he had nowhere to go because both his father and mother had abandoned him, and he found himself trapped. On visitation days, he stood by the window hoping to see his mother, who never appeared. The institution's staff tried to console him, making excuses for why his mother wasn't there, claiming she was unwell or had some other reason for not showing up. After some time, the boy resigned himself to his situation. He and the other children simply imagined that their parents needed a break. In reality, they hadn't been abandoned. In David's case, it didn't resemble the truth, but partly, the children were right. During those times, such institutions were used, as horrifying as it may sound, to essentially leave a child there. David later recalled a boy who regularly spent summers at the clinic because his parents sent him to the mental institution, treating it as a summer camp while they themselves went on vacation. Miraculously, when they returned from vacation, their son somehow recovered from his mental illness. Doctors quickly assessed how intelligent David was. He always articulated his thoughts clearly and demonstrated exceptional abilities, vividly recalling sporting events. Because of this, the medical staff soon suspected that it was Eva, David's mother, who suffered from a mental disorder, not her son. They waited for her to get better so they could send David back home. However, every time they tried to organize the child's return home, his mother rejected him. When the boy turned 13, the clinic staff had no choice but to officially acknowledge that David had no mental abnormalities. However, he still had nowhere to go. Consequently, he was transferred to a children's home located just a few blocks away from his family's home. It must have been very painful for him to realize that his relatives lived nearby but didn't want anything to do with him. However, David found himself in a shelter with other boys going through adolescence, and since they didn't have the opportunity to interact with the opposite sex, it was quite natural for them to experiment in relationships with each other. As soon as David appeared in the children's home, another boy began demanding his attention. He was very persistent and blackmailed David by threatening to tell everyone about his stay in the mental institution. David resisted, but later in his diary, he would write that he gave in and kissed the young blackmailer, after which he immediately felt disgust and anger towards himself. Except for this incident, David settled quite well into the shelter. David Maust was inherently very intelligent, and even with the hardships he faced, his difficult childhood, time in the clinic, and the shelter, they couldn't affect his ability to learn. He didn't lose concentration and impressed others with his phenomenal memory. Life seemed to be improving, until suddenly, a feeling of rage began to awaken within him. By the age of 15, David assaulted another boy, Eddie. They were playing together when, for unknown reasons, David started to choke Eddie. Eddie nearly died, but David suddenly stopped upon realizing that Eddie was almost not breathing. He asked for forgiveness, and Eddie forgave him. Was this repentance sincere? It's unclear, as David may not have wanted trouble having nowhere else to go and trying to control himself. However, we know about this incident because he described it in his 87-page diary that he wrote in prison. Nonetheless, his self-control did not last long, as David soon attempted to strangle another boy, Daniel. They were in a room together, simply watching TV, when David grabbed a rope and wrapped it around Daniel's neck. Again, he stopped when he realized Daniel hadn't done anything wrong to him. I told myself enough, released the rope, and Daniel fell to the floor, he wrote in the diary. It was as if I was trapped inside myself and someone else was trying to kill Daniel, and I couldn't stop. He was contemplating his actions, convincing himself that it was wrong. David began to think that he couldn't control his actions or thoughts, which was probably terrifying for a teenager whose life lacked a normal parental model. Daniel survived but reported the incident, leading David to be returned to the institution for the mentally ill. Life seemed to promise improvement when the teenager turned 17. Along with a few other guys, he escaped from the clinic and decided to return home. To his immense disappointment, Eva had gotten married, and there was no place in her home for her unwanted son. Moreover, she told everyone that David was a disgrace to the family, and even pretended that he had never existed. To get rid of him, she convinced him to join the army. It's important to understand that it was 1971, amid the Vietnam War, but perhaps, for the boy, it wasn't the worst option. To give him something to do in life, a place to live, and useful skills, his mother sent him to the recruiter. David was accepted into the army and sent to Frankfurt, Germany. He served as a cook at a military base where civilians also lived. Among them was 13-year-old James McLister, whom everyone called Jimmy. His parents worked as engineers on the base. David and Jimmy met at the bowling alley. In the army, David discovered another talent. He played bowling superbly, participated in competitions, and earned decent money from it. David and Jimmy became friends and hung out until one evening, David woke up in his bed, naked with Jimmy. He erupted in anger. He suggested Jimmy go for a ride on a moped. Obviously, the boy trusted him completely, regarded him as an older brother, and fearlessly went along. If only he knew what David was thinking. They drove quite far from the base and reached a place where there remained a crater from a bomb from World War II. There, David tied Jimmy to a tree and beat him with a plank he found there. When Jimmy stopped breathing, his killer simply untied the body and left it there. David returned to the base and pretended as if nothing had happened. Of course, they searched for the boy, but found him only a month later. David was detained, but somehow convinced the court that it was an unfortunate accident. Supposedly, the boys damaged the moped and Jimmy crashed from it. David got scared, didn't know what to do, and just hid Jimmy's body. He was believed there was no evidence of murder, and David was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Interestingly, in prison, David behaved perfectly, earned a diploma, wrote to his family every week, and acquired new useful skills. His behavior was so exemplary that he was allowed to be considered for early release on parole, but he declined the offer. The young man began to understand what he was capable of and was afraid to be free. In confinement, he had plenty of time to reflect on what he had done, and he realized that if he were released, he would definitely kill someone else. He despised himself for such thoughts and feelings because they caused him revulsion. His lawyer later called him one of the most remarkable serial killers because he had a conscience. He felt sorry for killing people, sorry even until the moment when he killed again. He hated himself for what he had done. However, the thirst for murder returned, and he succumbed to it, killing again. It's a very peculiar pattern of behavior. Nevertheless, he was released in 1977 when he turned 23 years old. 2 years later, he settled in Chicago and befriended a teenage boy. Well, befriended is how it seemed. But sometimes when the boy stayed overnight, David had the desire to stab him. After another evening when they drank and the teenager fell asleep on the couch, David gave in to this uncontrollable urge. He stabbed him in the abdomen with a knife, almost disemboweling him, but the teenager survived. David was tried for attempted murder. On the witness stand, he lied, and he was found not guilty. What he said to make them believe him remains unknown. Perhaps he had another talent, being devilishly convincing when necessary. By the age of 27, David had failed to learn how to control his desires. In an attempt to understand what was happening to him, he recalled the kiss at the orphanage when a boy approached him. He speculated that this negative, intimate experience was the cause of his bad behavior. Therefore, he decided to find that boy, now a man, and kill him. He believed that by doing so, he could put an end to his destructive tendencies and desires. Thus, he set out on a hunt to direct his rage toward this man. However, upon arriving at the place where the boy used to live, he discovered that the man was in prison. So David wasn't the only one who, upon leaving that orphanage, ended up in trouble. He couldn't unleash his rage on his offender or suppress the urge to kill. Then, he spotted a boy, 15-year-old Donald Jones, completely innocent, who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, simply passing by his car. David convinced the teenager to get into the car under the guise of some simple, odd job and drove him to a remote area with quarries. Similar to his previous victim, he inflicted several stabs on Donald's abdomen. Later in his diary, he wrote about how the boy begged not to be killed, repeating, "Don't kill me, I'm only 15 years old." However, David couldn't stop himself. He then took the teenager to the waterlogged part of the quarry where he left him. Unable to escape on his own, the teenager perished. David decided not to wait for the body to be discovered and left the town. He knew that his uncle lived in Galveston, Texas. His uncle allowed David to stay with him and found him work in his construction company. Again, David proved himself as an excellent worker, but his uncle fired him when he accidentally damaged the company's van. Things got worse. He invited a 14-year-old boy to his hotel room, offering alcohol and illegal substances, but instead began beating him. Suddenly he stopped. As if the normal David took over and caught himself in this horrible act. He dropped the weapon and burst into tears, feeling ashamed. The boy survived, and David received a 5-year sentence. While in prison, he again thought that if released, he would continue killing. Investigators now started connecting him to the case of Donald, and in 1982, he was extradited to Chicago in connection with Donald Jones's murder. For a long time, they didn't find him fit to stand trial, returning him to a psychiatric clinic. However, after 10 years of awaiting trial, David admitted his guilt in 1994. He was sentenced to 35 years. The Cook County prosecutor wrote a report to the Illinois Department of Corrections, stating that he was the most dangerous inmate they would have. The sheriff even described him as a criminal equal to John Wayne Gacy. Nevertheless, due to David Maust waiting for trial and extradition for 12 years, his sentence was reduced by 12 years. Given his exemplary behavior as a prisoner, an additional 2 years were also deducted from his remaining sentence. David didn't want to be released and even wrote a 6-page letter to the Illinois Department of Corrections admitting that he couldn't control himself, wanted to stay in prison, and asked not to be released. At that time, there was a law in Illinois that allowed a convicted person to voluntarily remain in prison for life as a sexually violent offender. David was offered this option and replied in the letter, "Bring the papers, I will sign everything." But nobody came to him. According to his lawyer, the letter wasn't even read, and in 1999, he was released from custody. After another release, David moved to Oak Park, Illinois. He hoped that a new place of residence would allow him to start over, but just a year later, he attacked his friend Anthony by hitting him on the back of the head with a metal pipe. One might think that this time the police would take more serious action against him. However, no charges were even brought against him because Anthony was a former gang member who didn't want to involve the police and refused to testify against David. In 2002, when his parole ended, David decided to move again, this time to Hammond, Indiana. He found a job nearby, often frequented by and involving teenagers. By then, employers could already check the backgrounds of those they hired. Despite David's history of victimizing teenagers, he was simply allowed to work alongside young boys. He quickly resumed his old habits, visiting places where teenagers hung out, such as public pools. He offered the boys opportunities to earn money by giving them seemingly simple tasks. No teenager would refuse to earn some money by doing a seemingly easy task, but these tasks turned out to be sinister. This continued until Michael Dennis, 13 years old, and James Regagni, 16 years old, disappeared. David had met these boys that summer at the public pool and befriended them, inviting them over to his place. The last time they were seen was on September 10, 2003. When the boys vanished, the police initially assumed they might have just run away, especially considering Michael and James were rebellious. Therefore, the disappearance of these two boys didn't receive as much attention as the disappearance of 19-year-old Nick James on May 2, 2003. Nick James was not rebellious, and his family had been pressuring the police for several months. Investigators learned that he worked at a store with David Maust and checked his background. As they lacked evidence, they asked him to take a polygraph test, which he passed. He claimed not to have seen them for some time, which was essentially true. They didn't, however, ask if he had killed the boys. Despite passing the polygraph, investigators decided to search David's house. The officer with a canine, Emo, worked in 2003 with the purpose of finding bodies. The police invited the dog and its handler to search David Maust's basement. When the officer gave Emo the command, the dog began barking at the far wall of the basement, though it had been trained to act as if it were digging. The handler explained to investigators that this behavior was odd because the dog was doing something contrary to its training, But breaking the concrete and seeing what was behind it was necessary, as there must be a reason the dog wouldn't leave that particular spot. A week later, they were asked to return to the same house. Officers drilled a deep hole in the floor and found nothing. They circled to another side, drilled a longer hole, yet still found nothing. So they gave up. They asked them to return again with the dog. This time, Emo immediately approached the hole and lay down. The officer couldn't capture this on video and asked the handler to command the dog again. Then the dog moved to another hole and lay down once more. Police brought in a concrete specialist and found out David had used an enormous amount of concrete, around 80 bags or so. Obviously, this was done to hide something, presumably bodies. Finally, the police removed the concrete and found 3 bodies. David had suffocated James and Michael in his apartment and buried them under the basement with Nick. Suddenly, David's mother and brother, who had not spoken to him for many years, appeared. Jeffrey gave many interviews, questioning whether what happened could have been prevented if the police had paid attention to David earlier. He spoke about terrible things that his brother allegedly did in childhood, but he had no evidence. Moreover, his mother and brother, who had not communicated with David for many years, seemed to thirst for fame, and Jeffrey even wanted to write a book. His attorney, Thomas Wayne, stated that David was indeed a serial killer, but he wasn't born one. The attorney sincerely believed that if someone sought the recipe for creating a serial killer, then his childhood was precisely that. He never learned to live in society or communicate with other people. In November 2005, David pleaded guilty to the murders and was sentenced to 3 life imprisonments. In January 2006, at the age of 51, David passed away. A note was found in his cell where he confessed to 5 murders, including 3 in Hammond. He wrote how disappointed he was not to have been sentenced to death because he felt he deserved it. He believed that if he had been kept away from society, he wouldn't have committed as many crimes as he did. Additionally, he didn't want taxpayers to pay for his existence. He asked for forgiveness from the victims' families and took responsibility for everything he had done. He didn't blame his parents or upbringing, only himself. David wrote that he loved his family, but they never reciprocated.
Toulouse, February 27, 1989. 21-year-old Valerie Tarot was found dead in her home. The scene that unfolded before the eyes of the police was shocking in its cruelty. Valerie lay on the bed, wearing a bathrobe, her wrists bound with a shoelace, a scarf in her mouth as a gag. It was soaked in blood that had flowed from her throat. The room floor was covered with the torn underwear of the girl, ripped in half. One obvious injury on her body was a strangulation mark on her neck. The autopsy provided even more food for thought for the police. 2 scarves were found deep in Valerie's throat, and the results of the toxicological examination showed that she had been under the influence of some substances. There were so many of them that they alone could have caused her death. Furthermore, a few days earlier, a building worker in which the girl lived found Valerie's backpack in the trash. Inside were her documents, an ashtray, cigarette butts, a glass, shoes, keys to the apartment, and a blood-stained bedside lamp. Gathering all this information, the investigators concluded that the girl had voluntarily left this life. The case was closed. Of course, such a conclusion did not satisfy Valerie's relatives, who tried unsuccessfully to persuade the police to investigate the case as a murder. 11 months later, hikers on the trail to Fenouil found a wallet and documents belonging to a girl named Laure Martin. On the same day, in a canal approximately 20 kilometers away in Bonrepos-Roquette, they discovered the lifeless body of a 19-year-old girl. She was completely naked, except for her socks. It was indeed Laure, who had been missing for 2 days. The autopsy revealed that the girl died from strangulation. However, prior to her death, she had been sexually assaulted anally and vaginally with an object, apparently a baseball bat. Additionally, the forensic expert found a torn spleen, indicating a very strong blow to the abdomen, such as a kick. The police began an investigation, but the investigators did not come across any significant leads, and of course, it never occurred to anyone to establish a connection between the 2 cases. 7 years passed, and it was the morning of February 11, 1997. At 9 o'clock in the morning, firefighters entered an apartment in a multi-story building located on the 4th floor in Toulouse. Inside, they discovered the lifeless and charred body of a 29-year-old woman named Martin Matthias. Martin was lying face down on the bed. On the floor, there was a magazine from an automatic pistol, and in the bathroom, there was a blood-stained and torn bra. The bathtub and the carpet was stained with blood, and there was also a light bulb on the floor, which had been unscrewed. The firefighters concluded that there were 2 points of fire, 2 clear attempts of deliberate arson in the bedroom, and in the living room near the armchair. The police inspector in charge of the investigation combined all these pieces of evidence and concluded that Martin's death occurred as a result of a decision made by Martin herself. 10 days later, on February 22, 1997, 21-year-old Emily Isps entered a bar in Toulouse. It was the afternoon, and she wanted to have a drink with her friends. In the bar, she met a pleasant and attractive guy named Patrice. Patrice had his own way of attracting girls because he distributed prohibited substances to Emily and her friends. Patrice and Emily spent the remaining part of the day and the following morning together. In the evening, the young man planned to go to a concert and invited Emily to join him. She accepted his invitation. However, before the concert, they met up with Patrice's friend, Eve, with whom he had been living for some time. The group of young people had dinner together and had some drinks. Then Patrice and Emily got into Patrice's car and headed to the concert, which they arrived at around 1:30 a.m. Emily danced a lot, while Patrice spent more time at the bar drinking beer. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Emily, feeling tired as she hadn't slept for 2 days, asked her new acquaintance to drive her home. The exhausted girl hadn't even had a chance to sit in the car when she immediately fell asleep. When she woke up, it seemed to her that only a moment had passed, but she was already lying on the back seat of the car. Opening her eyes, Emily was astonished to see Patrice above her with bulging eyes, choking her. He no longer resembled the pleasant guy she had spent the whole day with. Emily couldn't understand how someone could spend an entire day with such a nice guy and then, within a minute, he turned into a monster who was now strangling her. Emily tried to resist. She screamed, scratched Patrice, and tried to tear his hair. He ordered her to shut up and struck her face several times, after which Emily lost consciousness. A few minutes later, she woke up without her panties. He must have tried to violate her. Emily thought that she probably wouldn't survive and decided to pretend to be dead or talk to him. She chose to talk to Patrice, trying to remain calm and relieve tension. She repeated that she understood everything, that such things happen when someone drinks too much, that everything was fine, and she wouldn't tell anyone anything. Patrice stopped the car and asked her to please him. Emily refused. Then he moved to the back seat with her, continued undressing her, and violated her again. Emily did her best to stay calm. She continued talking to him, minimizing the harm he had caused her. Suddenly, Patrice burst into tears and said he regretted what he had done. He said to Emily, "You hold 10 years of my life in your hands." Emily didn't think he was such a great actor, so he must have been sincere. Hope arose within her again. Emily calms down her assailant and tormentor. She speaks to him softly because her only thought is to get out of this nightmare alive. She managed to calm Patrice down, and she asked him to drive her home. He refused. So they went to Eve, a friend where Patrice was staying. They lay down to sleep together in one bed, but Patrice didn't touch Emily anymore. Expectation set in. Emily went through hell, but she's alive. She knew that Eve was in the neighboring room, so she felt slightly safer, despite the fact that the attacker was sleeping just a few centimeters away from her. The girl managed to doze off for a few hours until she heard Eve and his girlfriend wake up. Emily got up and found them in the kitchen. Eve and Nora, his girlfriend, were horrified when they saw bruises on Emily's face. She explained to them that she was attacked by a guy at the concert. She didn't see his face because it was covered by a hood. Emily lied, protecting Patrice, but mainly to protect herself. After all, She was still in a state of shock and deeply shaken. Perhaps she wasn't fully aware of what was happening, as if her soul had detached from her body. This is a common defense mechanism for people who have experienced trauma. Eve quietly took her aside and asked if Patrice had anything to do with it, because even though Patrice was staying with him, Eve knew that his ex-girlfriend had kicked him out after a major argument, and Eve didn't fully trust him. Nora insists that Patrice had nothing to do with it, that it was a guy from the concert. Patrice woke up and also went to the kitchen. He confirmed Emily's story. Yes, it was a guy in a hood. Unfortunately, there was no chance of catching him. In any case, Nora drove Emily to the hospital. Doctors found signs of strangulation on the girl's neck. Additionally, she had several injuries on her face. She would have to spend a few days in the hospital under medical observation. In the hospital, Emily finally felt safer. She decided to tell the truth about what really happened, that Patrice attacked her. However, he suspected that Emily might confess everything, so he had already disappeared. Now, after one of Patrice's victims survived, the police finally start searching for him. He will be on the run for 3 months. On June 14, 1997, at a rural festival, Patrice, who now calls himself Frank, met Murray Norman. Murray, 35 years old, lived in a chalet in a small town below Foire. Murray felt sorry for the young man who complained about having nowhere to stay and offered him to live with her in exchange for doing some housework. Besides, on the 20th, Murray planned to visit her parents and decided that Frank would take care of the house. That's how Murray and Frank lived together for several days. During the day, he worked in the garden, fixed things, and in the evening, they had dinner together, talked, and smoked. On June 19th, Murray and Frank had a great time. Murray got a new job at a wolf sanctuary in Oulu, so she arranged a celebratory dinner. They drank a lot and smoked cannabis. Obviously, both of them were in an uplifted mood, and Frank, that is, Patrice, tried to kiss Murray. But she clearly wasn't ready for it and went into the bedroom, trying to avoid an unpleasant situation. However, the man followed her into the room, grabbed her by the head, and hit her against the wall. Murray felt dizzy, but she managed to break free from his grasp. Then Patrice picked up a chair and hit his victim, who had fallen unconscious on the bed. He brutally assaulted her several times. When this brought her back to consciousness, he started choking her with his bare hands, but when he released her throat, Murray was still breathing. Then Patrice tied her ankles and wrists and gagged her. After doing all this, he took Murray's body to the first floor and began cleaning up to remove all traces of blood. He painted the blue carpet with blue paint to conceal the blood stains. He used an angle grinder to remove the top layer of wooden furniture that had blood stains on it. The killer burned Murray's sheets and clothes in the garden and washed his own in the washing machine. Then he wrapped the victim's body in a blanket, dug a hole in the garden, and buried Murray in her own garden the following evening. Before leaving the chalet, he stole 5,000 francs in cash and some valuable items that could be sold, including the angle grinder. And in an attempt to divert suspicion from himself, he left a note on the table: "Murray, I don't know where you are, I finished my work and I'm leaving." On June 20, 1997, Patrice was driving Murray's car and heading to Spain. It was also his 29th birthday. A few days later, Patrice was already in Alicante, in the south of Spain. There he met 2 French girls, Isabelle and Valerie. The young people quickly became friends and spent several days together, sunbathing on the beach, having meals together, and going for walks. Then the girls' vacation ended, and it was time for them to return to Paris. They promised to meet again someday and exchanged phone numbers. If only they knew. Patrice continued his journey, visiting Germany and Belgium, before arriving in Paris on September 1, 1997. Of course, he called Isabelle and Valerie, and that same evening they agreed to have dinner together at a restaurant. The girls were happy to see their new friend again, but Patrice explained his situation to them. His car and all his money had been stolen. He was quite skilled at portraying himself as a victim. He asked the girls if one of them could let him stay with them for 2 days before his departure. Valerie couldn't accommodate him, as she was leaving for a business trip the next day, but Isabel allowed him to spend the night on her sofa, with the condition that it wouldn't exceed 4 days. On September 4, 1997, the residents of the same apartment building where 31-year-old Isabel Schicheri lived woke up to a loud explosion. It turned out that the explosion followed a fire that had started in the girl's apartment. Her partially burned body was found lying on the bed. The gas burners in the kitchen were turned on, and the fire broke out near the bathroom. It was evident that Isabel's death was not accidental. The front door was not forced open, and there were 3 glasses, a bottle of pink wine, and champagne on the table. The wounds on the victim's body indicated the incredible cruelty of the killer. There was blood in the toilet, and blood was flowing from her mouth, nose, and anus. However, no trace of semen was found on Isabel's body. Instead, a blood-stained carrot was found near the mattress. The autopsy would confirm that the perpetrator tortured the girl with it. Moreover, she had been severely beaten. The blows were inflicted all over her body, but mainly on her face. Asphyxiation was the cause of death. When investigators learned that Isabel had sheltered a man named Patrice, they immediately paid attention to this detail because the police had been searching for a certain Patrice for some time. And it was all thanks to the testimony of Emily SB, who managed to survive Patrice Allegre's attack at the end of February. Then, after the disappearance of Mireille Norman, her relatives, who were expecting her as a guest, became worried. However, it took 3 weeks before her body was found tied up and buried in the garden. But after the discovery of the body, the gendarmes' suspicions were closely linked to Patrice. Because although he presented himself under a false name, many witnesses had seen his face and recognized him from the pictures presented by the investigators. When he returned to Paris in early September, he was already actively being sought. The search warrant for him circulated throughout France. The police contacted his relatives and friends and promised a reward for assistance in his capture. And then Patrice contacted a friend and asked if he could stay overnight in Paris. That's when the investigators saw an opportunity to apprehend him. They asked this man to call Patrice back and direct him to an ideal location for capture in Châtenay-Malabry. On September 5, 1997, at 5:10 p.m., Patrice entered the house where the police were already hiding. He didn't resist arrest. According to some witnesses, he even seemed relieved to be arrested, as if he were tired of hiding. Surprisingly, the arrest of the serial killer did not attract much attention from the public. Perhaps it was because the media did not report that a serial killer was on the run, as the investigators initially could not establish a connection between the different cases. But it was also because another tragedy dominated the headlines: the car accident, and the death of Princess Diana in Paris on August 31, 1997. As a result, Patrice's arrest did not receive much attention. It didn't make big headlines. When he was interrogated, Patrice willingly cooperated. He confessed to his crimes and described them in detail. It was horrifying because he described them in the present tense, as if reliving them, but with a completely detached expression. Patrice was arrested for the attack on Emily SB and the murders of Mireille Norman and Isabel Schicheri. However, when Patrice talked about Mireille Norman, the girl who allowed him to stay in her chalet in exchange for work in the garden, he referred to her by a different name. He called her Martin, which made the investigators wonder. Gradually, they began to realize that he was confusing her with another one of his victims. Knowing Patrice's affinity for elements of luxury life, investigators offer him champagne, oysters, foie gras, and more outdoor walks in exchange for him revealing information about his other victims. And indeed, after this, Patrice confessed to killing 3 more women: Martin Mathias, Laure Martine, and Valérie Thériault. Only after the puzzle pieces started coming together as evidence, already known to the detectives. As it is already known, in the cases of Martin Mathias and Valérie Thériault, investigators concluded that they had taken their own lives. However, It turned out that Patrice personally knew all the women. Valérie Thériault was his colleague, they both worked as waiters at the same café in Toulouse. Laure Martin lived with him in the same region of Toulouse, so she got into his car because she recognized him. As for Martin Mathias, she was Patrice's neighbor. They lived in apartments opposite each other. In other words, from the very beginning, many clues pointed to Patrice Allegre as a possible suspect, but investigators did not notice them for a long time. It was unusual for a serial killer. Patrice knew all his victims personally, even if sometimes only for a couple of days, as in the case of Emily, but he always followed the same script: we spend time together, go out, become friends, and then an attack follows. Although Patrice assisted the investigation during interrogations and quickly confessed to the killings, investigators and later psychiatrists noticed that when it came to discussing the murders, he found it much more difficult to provide explanations. Each time, his version of events sounded like this: he tried to kiss the victim, she refused, he became enraged and strangled her. In some cases he used objects to assault the victims, but the man himself insisted that he did everything alone. This indicates that his version of the murders and attacks does not correspond to reality. Is it a lie, or does he remember the events poorly? It's hard to say, but in any case, it casts doubt on his confession. For example, let's consider the case of Martin Mathias. Patrice recalls how he met her at McDonald's in early February 1997. He asked if he could sit at her table, and they started talking, finding a common topic in boxing. Martin Mathias was the boxing champion of France, and Patrice had practiced it in the past. According to Patrice, Martin agreed to meet him again and invited him to have a drink at her place a few days later, and it was during this meeting that everything went wrong. However, the autopsy doesn't fully support this version. Toxicological analysis revealed alcohol and chloroform in her system, even though she didn't drink, and there was a mark of an electric shock in the intimate area of her body. As you may recall, a light bulb was unscrewed in the apartment, and something was done to the electrical wiring. This leads to the speculation that the girl did not invite Patrice to her place, but he stalked her because he lived across the street. Then he incapacitated her because under normal circumstances, Martin Mathias was stronger than him. Of course, there are no facts that definitively confirm this, but it is important to note that there are discrepancies between the story told by the killer and the evidence. And this implies that he is not striving to be completely honest with the investigation. Moreover, he spoke eagerly and extensively about his childhood. Patrice was born on June 20th in Toulouse. His mother, Michelle, was a hairdresser and became pregnant with a boy at the age of 17. His father, Roland, was 4 years older than her and worked as a police officer. Patrice always knew that he was an unwanted child. 7 years later, Michelle and Roland had their second son, a desired child. Patrice's childhood could not be called happy. His parents often argued, and his father would physically abuse his mother. Patrice tried to intervene, but he only ended up getting beaten himself. Roland, being a police officer, was often absent from home, paying little attention to his son. Patrice's mother, on the other hand, showed little affection towards him. However, she was an alcoholic, and when Patrice was young, she fell into an alcoholic coma right in front of him in her beauty salon. She was also unfaithful to her husband and constantly cheated on him. Patrice became a witness to some of her intimate encounters as well as the reconciliations between Michelle and Roland after fights. Often, when he tried to sleep in his room, he would hear his mother's moans from the adjacent room and would cover his head with a pillow, trying to drown out those sounds. Another time, she derived pleasure from one of her friends in the car while 6-year-old Patrice sat in the back seat and saw everything. Despite all this, Patrice despised his father and idealized his mother. He would defend her and couldn't stand it when people spoke ill of her. He had difficulty studying in school, and he had to repeat a year several times. He would skip classes, and his mother allowed him to do so. During this time, he began committing crimes, stealing and selling drugs. However, Every time he was arrested, his father would come to his rescue. For example, Roland once paid 30,000 francs as compensation to the victims of Patrice's thefts. The roots of his behavior possibly trace back to a traumatic event that occurred when he was 13 years old. He ran away from home, and two boys abducted him. They drugged the boy with heavy illicit substances and subjected him to abuse in a car, after which they discarded him on the side of a remote road. This couldn't have left scars on a boy who was not yet 14 years old. This certainly doesn't justify what he did afterwards, but it provides an opportunity to better understand him. It was from the age of 14 that he started drinking heavily and using illicit substances. The problem was that Patrick, who was described as charming when sober, completely changed under the influence of some substances. He became truly aggressive to the point where his friends who knew about it were afraid of him. Once, when he was drunk at a bar, someone said something bad about his younger brother, and Patrick flew into a rage. He left, but then returned to the bar with a weapon, which he held to the person's head and pulled the trigger. By some miracle, the gun didn't fire, and Patrick was apprehended. It could have been his first and last murder. Patrice Allegre committed his first attack on a girl when he was only 17 years old. He met the girl at a party, and initially, everything was going fine. They went to a park where Patrice tried to make advances towards the girl, but she pushed him away. As you can already understand by this point, rejections drove him into a rage. The guy started choking the girl but quickly stopped, apologized, and took her home. However, his modus operandi was already beginning to emerge. Interestingly, Patrice never had problems with girls, but the problem was that there were these two sides. As long as the girl agreed, he was charming, but if she rejected him, he obtained what he desired by force. As for long-lasting romantic relationships, Patrice had two of them in his life. The first one was with a woman named Cecile. They met in 1986 when Patrice was 18, and it was their first true love story. The young couple dated for 7 years, and they had a daughter together. However, in 1989, a few months after committing his first murder, their relationship ended. Their relationship resembled the relationship of Patrice's parents. They would argue a lot, and Patrice would physically attack Cecile. But with Cecile, Patrice could somewhat restrain himself. For example, when he attempted to strangle her, he stopped with the words, "No, not you, not you." In 1994, Cecile ended up in the hospital with a broken jaw. She filed a complaint against Patrice, who was arrested for several weeks. In 1995, Cecile finally decided to break up with Patrice. The following year, he met Sylvie, with whom he would live until February 1997 when Sylvie also left Patrice due to his aggression. It was precisely then that Patrice moved into his friend Eve's house and attacked Emily Isps. The trial of Patrice began on February 11, 2002, in Toulouse. He was accused of 6 acts of violence, 5 murders, and 1 attempted murder. During the trial, questions arose about numerous mistakes made by the police during the investigation of Valérie Thariot and Martin Matthias, who concluded it was a suicide. There were even rumors that the police were protecting Patrice, considering his father was one of them. However, this was just a conspiracy theory. Patrice's case was subject to analysis by psychiatrists, which was rare for criminal cases in France. One of the most interesting aspects was his contrasting attitudes towards his mother and father. He idealized his mother but demonized his father. At the age of 13, he even suggested to his mother that they should kill his father. Despite this, Roland Allegre, Patrice's father, appeared in court, took the witness stand, and looked his son in the eyes, saying that despite everything he had done, he still loved him. Patrice's response was, "Well, I don't love you, I hate you, I should have killed you, as I told Mom, then I wouldn't have caused so much harm." He drew a parallel between his crimes and his father. However, he always refused to blame his mother for anything. Psychiatrists believe that a significant influence on him was the trauma caused by his mother's intimate explosions. Once terrorized by his mother's moans as a child, he transformed into a strong man who terrorized women, suppressing their moans, the very soul of these women. Interestingly, he always attacked his victims when they were unconscious, and the first victim who managed to calm him down, convince him not to kill her, was Emily, who was lucky enough to wake up and speak to him. Such a feeling as if he could render girls unconscious, he could do whatever he wanted with them, but when Emily woke up, she regained her human face. He himself said, "I have a memory lapse. I remember choking her. Then she came to, and I apologized. It brought me to my senses. I'm ashamed of what I did. I don't know what to say." It is also interesting why girls suddenly refused him, even though it seemed obvious that there was an attraction between the young people. The psychologist thinks that he himself provoked the women's rejection, subconsciously, of course. He wanted to have power over the victims because it is common among killers who have themselves experienced violence in childhood. He wanted to transform from a passive victim into an active killer who could fully control the situation. It was their abnormal way of regaining control over the situation. As for the motive, it would seem easy to answer this question since he violated all his victims. However, it's not that simple. Although this explanation seems most obvious, he himself confirmed that he did not derive pleasure during the attacks. According to a psychiatrist who examined him, for someone who sometimes has normal relationships and at other times commits terrible murders, he is not simply a sexual maniac. Having control over the situation was of much greater significance. In essence, it was violence that turned into humiliation rather than humiliation turning into violence. He himself could never answer why he killed. He hoped that psychiatrists would provide him with an answer to this question, which is why he eagerly spoke with them. At the trial, another important question arose. Did Patrice have other victims, especially during the break between 1990 and 1997? Since some of his known victims did not receive proper investigation, it is quite possible. Patrice himself claims that he did not kill anyone else, but can he be trusted? Initially, he only confessed to 2 murders and 1 act of violence. The police formed a team of specialists to determine if he could be responsible for other unsolved crimes. Another promise of a walk, as well as champagne and oysters, allowed them to elicit a hint from Patrice about the unsolved case of Lynn Gabaldi's murder. They examined 191 unsolved cases since 1984, and they managed to find 2 witnesses who were former prostitutes involved in Lynn Gabaldi's case. Florencia Chigliafi, who appeared in the press under the pseudonym Fanny, and Christelle Berg, known to the public as Patricia. Together, they accused Patrice of Lynn's death. However, in addition to him, they implicated the prosecutor of Toulouse, Marc Bourrage, in criminal activities. Allegedly, he organized sadomasochistic parties where politicians and judges would enjoy themselves. Fanny claimed that the girls did not attend the parties willingly. They were subjected to abuse, torture, and sometimes killed. And Lynn Gabaldi provided the prostitutes for the orgies. She threatened to expose everything to the police, so on the orders of Marc Bourrage, Patrice killed her. Dominique Baudis's name was mentioned once. He was the former mayor of Toulouse. Supposedly, he was present during Lynn's murder along with Bourrage. Seeing the growing tension surrounding his case, Patrice wrote a letter to a well-known show, stating that Baudis and Bourrage were indeed part of a criminal network. 2 weeks later, the same show aired an interview with Fanny, who talked about the children she saw chained in a torture room on the ground floor of a house near Toulouse. However, just 15 days after confessing to Lynn Gabaldi's murder, Patrice retracted his statement. It was later revealed that the show's producers had generously paid Patrice and Fanny for their stories. It also emerged that Dominique Baudis couldn't have been present at Lynn's murder because he was in Paris. And Marc Bourrage didn't even know Patrice. The accusations against the politicians were dropped, and Patrice and Fanny were charged with providing false testimony. In July 2005, Fanny and Patrice were sentenced to 18 months and 3 years in prison, respectively, for giving false testimony. On February 21, 2002, Patrice Allegre was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 22 years. He is now 54 years old and has already served the mandatory 22 years. During this time, he entered into a relationship with a psychologist from Canada who moved to France and settled closer to her beloved in prison. Surely, Patrice wants to see the woman and his daughter outside of prison. He applied for early release but abandoned the idea due to the conclusions of psychiatrists who believe that despite all his efforts, he has not been rehabilitated, and the risk of relapse is extremely high. Emily Isps, the only surviving victim of Patrice's attack, who testified against her assailant in court, passed away in 2006, 9 years after the incident. Unfortunately, she made this decision on her own. One woman risked herself to escape the clutches of a predator. Driven by her desire to return home alive to her children, she had no idea that her assistance in capturing the kidnapper would uncover a much greater evil and save many other lives. Collaborating with the police, the girl managed to reveal the true nature not only of the rapist but also of a serial killer. However, the way her memories of the attack were obtained raised doubts about the truthfulness of her words. The prisoner measured the field with his steps, moving across the ground with his feet shackled in chains. Without taking his eyes off the tall yellow grass, he immersed himself in memories. So much water had flowed since the last time he was here. His dark auburn beard had turned completely grey. The usual clothing he was accustomed to, jeans, a shirt and a cap, had become a luxury. Now he was accompanied by police officers whom he had once diligently avoided. Breaking nearly 2 decades of silence, the prisoner had just taken responsibility for the disappearance of several young women in the 90s. And now he had agreed to lead the police to their bodies, buried in a field outside Houston, Texas. For years, families in Texas and Oklahoma had wondered what happened to their daughters who vanished under ordinary circumstances. During a morning jog, at a car wash, returning home after a theater group party. For a long time, they had no answers to their questions. Then the man standing behind their agony, a 56-year-old Texas prisoner accused of violence and abduction but not murder, suddenly spoke up. Police were able to link the kidnapper to at least 7 victims, including 4 girls who did not survive their encounter with him. Together, these cases paint the portrait of a serial killer, disguised as a benevolent Samaritan targeting a specific type of young brunettes found on the streets. The unexpected confession helped uncover the secrets of what happened to some of them, but the most pressing question for the families remains: why? In May 1997, 19-year-old Sandra Sapor graduated from high school and worked as an exotic dancer. She was raising 2 children and preparing to become a mother for the 3rd time. People who knew Sandra described her as intelligent and determined. It was these qualities that would ultimately save her life and unlock Pandora's box of other horrifying crimes. On May 17, 1997, the police responded to a call from a terrified young woman. It was Sandra Sapor. She recounted the nightmare she had just experienced. She had been kidnapped, and in order to escape, she had thrown herself out of a moving car. After reporting the crime, she was taken to a local hospital. It was there that she spoke with the police. Despite suffering serious injuries, Sandra insisted on talking to the detectives to prevent the kidnapper from harming anyone else. However, the fall from the moving vehicle had affected her memory. Details that would have aided the investigation were lost in her subconscious. Nevertheless, Sandra's memory would become an important tool in solving the crime. Since the police initially had no leads to pursue a suspect, they decided to approach the investigation from a different angle and arranged for Sandra to undergo hypnosis. After the session, she recalled minute details of the crime. She not only identified the model and color of the kidnapper's car but also remembered his face. It was a major breakthrough in the case. Sandra's description corroborated the version that the police had already developed regarding the potential suspect. Several weeks after the hypnosis, Sandra was asked to identify the man who attacked her from a lineup of several men. She identified a man named William Lewis Reece. Reece had long been known to the police due to his behavior and criminal history. Reece grew up on a farm nearby in Yukon, Oklahoma. Despite a difficult childhood, he had a particularly close relationship with his mother, who was willing to do anything for her son. A young William dropped out of school in the 9th grade to work, specializing in horseshoeing. By the age of 19, Reece stood before a priest and vowed to spend his life with a shy girl named Judy Fleming, whom he met in Anadarko, a city located about an hour's drive from Oklahoma City. He said if I didn't date him, he would shoot himself, Judy recalls. Initially, she believed in the young husband's good intentions, but soon realized that he could be incredibly cruel. The marriage did not go well from the start. Even before their first anniversary, Judy left her husband because she says he cheated on her. However, they reconciled and soon started a family, having a boy and a girl. But in 1982, Judy filed for divorce again. This time, it was because her husband showed aggression towards her. He broke into my new house and beat me. He held a knife to my throat, pushed me to the floor, and threatened me with a sawed-off shotgun, recalls Judy. At some point, Reece decided to leave Judy alone. He married and divorced for the second time. Judy remembers that his second wife called her multiple times, begging her to take Reece back. However, Judy, remembering how he once hit her so hard that half of her face turned into a solid bruise, refused the offer. Perhaps it was due to the 2 divorces that Reece plunged into a pit of alienation and loneliness, and his hatred towards women grew to such proportions that he saw no other way but to embark on a barbaric path of violence. On a fateful spring day in 1986, the daughter of a sheriff's deputy stepped out of the University of Oklahoma building and headed to work as an aerobics instructor when her Mustang got stuck on the interstate highway, Interstate 35. The 19-year-old girl panicked. The rain poured down heavily. A tall fence separated her from the hotel and shopping center where she could seek help. Just as she was contemplating how to climb over it, a truck pulled up beside her. Behind the wheel sat 26-year-old William Reece, offering assistance. Relieved, the girl got into the car. But instead of driving her to a phone, Reece stopped the car, grabbed the student, and threw her onto a mattress in the sleeper cabin of the truck. "Why are you doing this to me?" she screamed. The man simply replied, "He's crazy." Reece tied the girl's hands behind her back with sticky tape, stuffed her into an orange sleeping bag, and continued driving. When he parked the truck next time, he forced the girl to satisfy his desires. Later, at the trial, she would recount, "He pulled up his pants, said he loved me, that he was alone, and that we would always live in Houston." The girl played along with Reece to gain his trust and convinced him to let her use the restroom. Instead, she hurried to a payphone and called her family. While awaiting trial for the abduction and assault of his first victim, Reece attacked a woman he followed from a bar. He was found guilty of 2 assaults and sentenced to 25 years in prison. However, in October 1996, an appellate court was forced to reduce his sentence to only 10 years due to inappropriate comments made by the prosecutors. With nowhere else to go, Reece returned to his mother in Anadarko, where many locals knew little about his past. He seemed very polite, according to Kathy Dobra, a family friend who drove Reece to town as a favor to his mother so he could obtain a new driver's license. Now she regrets how foolish she was, never even thinking to ask why he had been in prison because it didn't concern her or her family. Not until the summer her teenage daughter disappeared. The spring of 1997 was cool, preparing to give way to the hot summer. The FBI had not yet established a national DNA database. Most Americans did not yet own mobile phones. Reece, approaching his 40s at that time, had recently moved to Houston. He found work on a construction site and also earned money by shoeing horses. One ranch owner recalls sensing that something was off about the new worker. Butch Bloodworth witnessed Reece striking a horse with a thick stick because the animal refused to stand still. He also made strange compliments to young girls and tried to sell the ranch owner a stolen bulldozer. However, at that time, no one knew that Reece, as the ranch owner would later note, was scouting for horses to shoe, things to steal, and girls to kill in the area. All they knew was that young women were going missing in the town. The crime rate had increased in the area along Interstate 35 and Interstate 45, from Oklahoma to southeast Texas. This region coincided with where Reece lived and worked. He was suspected of crimes due to his criminal record, but there was never enough evidence to hold him accountable. In particular, on April 3, 1997, just a few months after Reece was released and exactly 11 years after his first known attack, young ballerina Laura Smith failed to return home for breakfast after her morning jog in the suburb of Houston, Friendswood, Texas. The body of the 12-year-old girl was later discovered near a pond in Pasadena, 12 miles away, naked and showing signs of strangulation. Her appearance resembled other victims of Reece, and the nature of the attack matched his modus operandi, but there was no evidence to link him to the crime. After Sandra Sapor identified Reece, the police were finally able to build a case against the man who, they suspected, had been terrorizing the two states for some time. They found new evidence, including witnesses, to build a case against him. Although investigators could directly link him only to Sandra's attack, they knew he was connected to a series of other gruesome crimes. He was arrested, and the trial began in April 1998. On the witness stand, Sandra recounted what happened on the day of her abduction. She had stopped at a Waffle House to grab a bite to eat. When she returned to her car, she noticed that her tire had been slashed. Not seeing anyone around, Sandra contemplated her next move. At that moment, a man approached her, claiming he had noticed the problem with her tire. He said he had tools in his car that could help, but she needed to assist him in retrieving them. Sandra followed the man to his car, where he grabbed a knife and threatened her, forcing her to sit in the passenger seat. Fearing for her life and the life of her unborn child, she complied. As he drove her further away from the Waffle House, the abductor again threatened her with the knife and demanded that Sandra undress. It was then that she realized that if she didn't escape right away, she would not make it back home. She flung open the car door from her side and threw herself onto the road. Despite sustaining injuries, she believes that this act ultimately saved her life, as if she hadn't escaped, her abductor would have become her killer. The details she provided about the assailant aligned perfectly with Reece. However, Sandra's testimony came under scrutiny because she recalled the attack only under hypnosis. The defense argued that Reece had been named a suspect in a nearby murder, and his name and photograph could have influenced the girl's memory. They claimed that relying on hypnosis, a method not recognized by the scientific community, especially in a kidnapping case, was unreliable. The defense put up a strong argument. However, after 5 hours of deliberation on Friday, May 8, 1998, the jury found William Reece guilty of aggravated kidnapping, and sentenced him to 60 years in prison. Reece managed to stay off the streets, allowing the community to breathe a sigh of relief. However, it would take several years before he would reveal the most hidden secrets he had kept throughout his life. Around the time he abducted Sandra, DNA testing practices had not yet gained widespread use. Other crimes from the 1990s that Reece could have been involved in remained unsolved. However, in the mid-2000s, as DNA testing became more popular, detectives revisited these cold cases and were able to find perpetrators for many of the crimes. One of such cases became a pivotal moment for William Reece, the moment when he decided it was time to break the silence. Tiffany Johnston, the 19-year-old daughter of Katie Dobra, a friend of the Reece family who had helped him obtain a driver's license, had recently gotten married. On July 26, 1997, she planned to celebrate 3 months since her wedding day but stopped at Sunshine Car Wash in Bethany, Oklahoma beforehand. Suddenly, a man approached her. Threatening her with a knife, he forced her into his van. Driving her away from the car wash, the man assaulted Tiffany, strangled her, and hid her body in tall grass near a lake. Tiffany's body was discovered the next day. At the time, a DNA sample was found and tested. However, the results were inconclusive, and the case remained unsolved until detectives reopened it in 2015. They were able to examine another DNA sample found on the victim's body, and it matched the DNA of the already convicted William Reece. When investigators wanted to talk to him, Reece and his attorney decided that to avoid the death penalty for Tiffany Johnston's case, he would plead guilty. But the surprise was that Reece agreed to cooperate with the police to close other cases in which he was involved. Perhaps his serious heart condition, which was discovered, played a role, or he wanted to gain something through this cooperation. He feels like a huge weight has been lifted off his chest, his attorney noted. However, serial killer expert Jack Levin was not convinced by such a sincere motive. He feels relieved not because he feels guilty about anything, but because he's proud of it, the expert says. Most serial killers are sadistic, viewing their crimes as their greatest accomplishments in life. They are masters of manipulation, using torture as a form of control and often evolving into killers out of necessity to leave no witnesses. Nevertheless, Reece led the police to an area in Houston known as the Texas Killing Fields. It earned its name due to the frequent occurrence of brutal crimes and the discovery of bodies. With Reece's help, the police found the remains of Kelly Cox and Jessica Kane. Kelly Cox was a psychology student at the University of North Texas in Denton. At the time of her murder in July 1997, 20-year-old Kelly was the mother of an 18-month-old daughter, who was cared for by her grandparents while her mother studied and worked. On July 15, 1997, as part of an outing for her criminology class, Kelly visited the Denton County Jail. Personal belongings were not allowed inside the jail, so Kelly hid her car key under the wheel, making sure it was secure. However, when she returned to her car later, the key didn't work. Kelly went to a gas station to call her boyfriend. He promised to come as soon as he could. When he arrived an hour later, he couldn't find her, and she was nowhere near her car. For years, Kelly's parents had hoped to find out where their daughter was and what had happened to her, continuing to care for their granddaughter all that time. When Reece confessed to Kelly's murder and led the police to her body, her parents and daughter finally got the answers they had been seeking. Jessica Kane, a 17-year-old high school student, whose remains were found near Kelly, was involved in theatrical productions. On the night of her disappearance in August 1997, she was returning home after a party with a close group of actors. Jessica's car was soon found abandoned on the shoulder of Interstate 45. Her purse was still inside. Police believed that Jessica saw the yellow headlights of the abductor's vehicle and, thinking it was a police officer trying to stop her, pulled over. However, like Kelly's case, the investigation into Jessica's disappearance had made little progress. Her body could not be found, and the police had little to work with. Reece's confession became a breakthrough in the case. After the discovery of the bodies, Reece was charged with the murders of Laura, Tiffany, Kelly, and Jessica. On May 28, 2021, in Oklahoma, the 61-year-old Reece was found guilty of the abduction and murder of Tiffany Johnston. On June 2, he was sentenced to the death penalty. He will now be transported back to Texas, where he will face charges for the deaths of Laura, Kelly, and Jessica. For years, Reece preyed on young girls and women, leaving them with deep emotional scars. He repeatedly proved himself to be a danger to society, and yet he was allowed to roam free for 5 months, during which he heartlessly abducted innocent girls and stole their dreams, and sometimes their lives. If it weren't for Sandra Sapo, it's unknown how many families today would be mourning their children, sisters, and wives. Sandra's survival story is extraordinary, and her brave escape from the clutches of a serial killer undoubtedly saved the lives of many other girls. Her courage led to the unraveling of other brutal crimes, providing answers to families who had long wondered about the fate of their loved ones.